Hola a todos, welcome back to the Tiki Tapas Podcast. For those who normally listen to us, there's going to be some slight changes today because what normally happens is Vic starts the intro, but he's just had an emergency tooth procedure which didn't go entirely to plan. So he's very kindly agreed to stay with us on today's episode, but you're not going to hear a word from him. So, Vic, sorry to hear about your tongue. Cat got your tongue in this literal sense. But yeah, from the next episode, he'll be back with his witticisms, transitions, and his usual hosting role. Today is also the first ever episode of the Tiki Tapas podcast where we have a guest, and it's a very exciting guest we have on today. It's a friend of mine, Dan, who hosts the HLTCO podcast, Patreon, Twitter, everything else, and he's a massive Palace fan, but covers European football, worldwide football. Essentially, he's a bit like us where he just absolutely loves football. And so today's episode, as you can see from my shirt, is going to focus solely around the Conference League final involving Crystal Palace and Rayo Vallecano. And yeah, we've put two La Liga heads alongside Dan, who's a hardcore Crystal Palace fan. He'll be in Leipzig. So yeah, Dan, just give a quick introduction of yourself for those who haven't encountered you before.
So yeah, I run the HLTCO Twitter page. With that, I do two daily podcasts, Monday to Friday. One specifically on Crystal Palace and one on football generally. They're both over on Patreon and they're both out by 8:30 each morning. Inside 25 minutes, just sort of rounding up everything that's going on. So obviously, at the moment, the Palace podcast is heavily centred around the UEFA Conference final and the climax of the season. But with the general one, there's all sorts going on. The end of the Premier League season, the World Cup squads being announced, the playoff finals, Southampton being booted out because of their spying. It's the game always has something to talk about. So yeah, I'm a very busy guy at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. And for those who do listen to HLTCO, I was on his podcast last week to talk about the final as well. And I was also on last year to talk about Yeremy Pino's move to Crystal Palace as a Villarreal fan myself. So yeah, we'll get started now. And the first thing I want to ask you, Dan, is what's the general feeling amongst Palace fans around the final? Because I feel like a lot of the media coverage and a lot of everything in England has actually there's been so many questions asked to Oliver Glasner about, the lineup against Arsenal on the final day. And that was with the title race in mind. But it feels like the final hasn't gone under the radar. But what's the general feeling amongst Palace fans? Are you guys confident? Are you excited? How are you feeling?
I'll be honest, I was a lot more confident and contented until I spoke to you for the podcast that we did last week, because it does very much feel as though there are a lot of very obvious parallels between Rayo and Crystal Palace going into last season's FA Cup final against Manchester City. Now, I appreciate that Crystal Palace have never been in Europe before this season. It's sort of virgin territory for us in that sense. But if you look at the financial disparity between not just Crystal Palace and Rayo, but the Premier League and everywhere else, it does make us runaway favourites to get the job done over in Leipzig. And I'm just not sure that it's going to be as straightforward as many outside of our fan base are predicting. I watched Aston Villa against Freiburg, obviously, on Wednesday evening, the Europa League final, and they made very light work of that. And it filled me with anxiety ahead of our final, because I think most are probably expecting from a neutral perspective that it's going to be a relatively similar story. But I mean, as you well know, Rayo don't play in the same way that Freiburg do. They will look to press us higher. They will be energetic. They will want to be, starting the game with a real venom to their play. And, from the conversation that we had last week, I've went back and watched every single highlights package I can probably find of them, both in the UEFA Conference and in LaLiga this season. And they are, I tell you one thing that surprised me is how much of a threat they are from set pieces, or at least it's looked that way. And that's not something we deal well with at all. And that has been an Achilles heel for us all season long. So, there's a number of issues really that have got me worried. But obviously, you can't help but go into a final. I think even if you were, say, a Manchester City or a Real Madrid going up against anybody, over 90 minutes, anything can happen. So, yeah, there's definitely a degree of apprehension from me.
Yeah, absolutely. And as is the case in most finals, it's rarely ever a walkover like it was with Villa the other day. And even then, it took several moments of serious individual quality to get them opening the scoring. So on to Palace. And yeah, like the lineup on the final day, it could end up being rotated anyway. But in terms of the final, how do you see Palace lining up? Who are the key players to look out for? Because we'll have a Rayo audience listening to this as well. And I'm sure they'll be keen on hearing where the main threats are for Palace.
Yeah, it's a bit of a difficult one going into the last day because Oliver Glasner has already spoken about the fact that with it being his last Premier League game as Palace boss, he doesn't want to sign off with a defeat. He doesn't want to just roll over. Obviously, there would have been a lot more pressure on our selection prior to Manchester City not getting a victory against Bournemouth in midweek because there would have been higher stakes from the terms of the Premier League and where it was going to end up. But I would imagine there will be a degree of rotation on the final day of the season. I don't want to see the likes of Adam Wharton, Daishi Kamada, Daniel Munoz, Ismail Assar getting 90 minutes. I understand the need to give them a few minutes, but we can rotate relatively well. It's not as though you're going to be putting out a team of 17 and 18-year-olds. There are plenty of fringe players that deserve minutes, and they're going to be going up against an Arsenal team who are not on the beach because they've still got the Champions League final, of course, but conserving their own energy. In terms of the 11 that you would expect us to put out against Rayo in the final, obviously, I mean, back five and goalkeeper sort of explains itself. Dean Henderson is ever present. He's our captain. Tyreek Mitchell is never out of the team on the left-hand side of the back five. Chris Richards at the moment is touch and go. He picked up an ankle ligament issue in the draw with Brentford, actually played on until the final moment, which I don't really understand the logic behind, but he isn't going to be involved on Sunday against Arsenal, and he's hopefully going to be back for that on Wednesday. Maxence Lacroix and JD Canvo next to him as the defensive trio. Daniel Munoz on the right-hand side. I would imagine that Daishi Kamada and Adam Wharton are almost locked in, really, in terms of the midfield pairing. And then on the right-hand side, Ismail Assar. On the left, it's sort of up in the air. It might be Pino. It might be Gesson. Gesson has only just come back from a knee issue that he was struggling with. He got some minutes off the bench against Brentford last weekend, and I would imagine the plan is to ease him back a little bit more against Arsenal, give him the start. But I'm not sure we're going to just necessarily dispense with either one of Brennan Johnson or Yeremy Pino on the left. And then I would imagine we would start with Mateta up front. It's still up in the air, depending on the tactical choice that you could see Strand Larsen starting as the number 9. But I think it's more likely that JP gets the nod in front of him. So, yeah, that's the likely 11 I would suggest for Wednesday.
Yeah, and it's obviously a team with a lot of quality. You've got 2 trophies under the bag in the last 12 months already, and it could be a third. So it's a very exciting time to be a Palace fan, but it's also a lot of pressure on this final, I'd say, because you haven't got Europe next season unless you win. And would you say that, how would you assess the season if you lose this final and you don't make Europe?
Well, from a Palace point of view, I think it's fair to say that Oliver Glasner has supercharged our expectations in many senses. Prior to his arrival, we'd never played in Europe before. We never had a major trophy under our belts. So in one way, he has sort of raised the bar to an unrealistic level when you consider the competitiveness of the Premier League, the money, the teams that we're going up against year after year. We do punch above our weight as it is. So, I mean, there is always a note of caution from me there. But at the same time, he has made it a big point to say that there's nothing gained by us sort of knowing our place in the pecking order. You want to dare, you want to try and fly a bit closer to the sun because you never know what's possible. And I think he has shown us, and I said this to somebody else yesterday, it's not as though he's just broken the glass ceiling. He's taken a figurative sledgehammer to it and shown us that you don't have to live in the confines of that building in your mind. So whoever comes in next, I'm not suggesting it's a transition like Pep Guardiola leaving Manchester City or Wenger or Ferguson leaving Arsenal or Manchester United, but it's a difficult challenge because we've sort of seen over the fence now. We know what is possible. So any manager that comes in and says, well, hang on a minute, we're Crystal Palace, you need to understand where we exist, we'll be like, well, Glasner didn't say that. So you automatically measuring yourself up against something that's probably not a reasonable expectation. But, I mean, to be honest, this season, in terms of our league position, you can look at it and say, oh, I think we've got 44 points going into the last day. We were never really in danger of being relegated. And from the moment we got through against Larnaca in the knockout rounds, it was all really focused on Europe, because we knew that it would be a ridiculous run to finish in the top 7 or 8, and we were balancing that against Europe. We've done extremely well against both Fiorentina and Shakhtar over 2 legs. You know, we absolutely hammered Fiorentina in the first leg, got the job done away from home, went to Shakhtar, went to Poland to play Shakhtar, scored after 21 seconds, had that game pretty much sewn up going back to Selhurst, but still did a professional job. And now we find ourselves in a final where everyone from a neutral perspective, and I'm not just talking about bookmakers, I'm talking about fans generally, are just assuming that it's a foregone conclusion that we're going to get the win. And that makes me uneasy, because all the way through this tournament, and whether you look at someone like a Fiorentina or a Shakhtar and say they are no longer the power they once were, they are still European royalty compared to us historically. Whereas Rayo don't have that reputation. And I feel that many people who haven't done the level of research that either one of you two will have done, or that I had done prior to this last couple of weeks, that they'll just assume, oh, it's just Rayo Vallecano. It is, but it isn't at the same time, because of the narratives that sort of play out alongside both clubs.
Yeah, absolutely. And we spoke about the similarities between both Rayo and Palace in that both their managers are leaving after the final. So there's a lot on the line in terms of the legacy they'll leave, but it's also a case of they've still achieved so much, no matter what happens in Leipzig. But there are some differences because, well, as you said, Palace were in a position where there was maybe a little bit of a whisper of relegation, maybe in January, just in terms of being in the battle. But then now, ever since then, it's been full throttle on Europe. That wasn't the case with Rayo, because the table in La Liga this season has been just absurd. It's been absolutely ridiculous, where there was a point where Rayo were still dangerously close to the bottom 3 whilst balancing Europe. And we said this on a previous episode. Do they go full throttle in Europe, or do they rotate and potentially lose but stay in La Liga? They've now achieved, they've not only achieved staying in La Liga, but if they beat Deportivo Alavés on the final day and other results go their way, they could be in Europe again. And for those who don't know much about Rayo, it's a miracle that they're even in La Liga. It is an even bigger miracle that they're even in Europe. And it is incomprehensible to us that they're in a European final. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. It's easy to say, oh, they're La Liga side. Well, yeah, they've reached Europe. They're probably going to lose to Palace. No matter what happens in this final, their fans, everyone around the club is just delighted to be there. And I think that means, as you say, there's a bit more pressure on Palace, and that is probably scary for you as a result, because Rayo can do anything in this final, and no matter what happens, even if they go and lose 3-0 like Freiburg did, there's still going to be a huge celebration after of the achievement of even just getting there. And if they end up in Europe again next season, they're still in a fairy tale land. And so, yeah, we'll come on to the similarities now in that. So I was at Rayo against Strasbourg, the first leg of the semi-final. And I said this to you on your one as well. That was a top 5 footballing experience in my life for me. And I've been to maybe 300 games across the world. The atmosphere, the feeling around the club, the emotion of the game, the stadium itself, everything was just incredible. But the story of Rayo is that their owner is dragging him to the ground, President Raul Martin Presa. There's protests against him every game. At times, the stadium pitch is unusable, and a game was postponed in La Liga this season because they tore up the pitch and couldn't use it in time against Real Oviedo. At times, the training ground has no hot water. And this is a team where the captain, Oscar Trejo, he threatened to resign from the captaincy last year. The manager's spoken out against the owners. Some of the players have spoken out against them. The fans are so vocal against them. It's not a club that's thriving off the pitch at all. So then when everyone came together and put one foot in the European final, it was absurd. It was incredible. And Rayo as a club, they're from one of the smallest, poorest neighborhoods in Madrid. They're a bit like Palace in a way that they're in a city, a huge footballing city with some of the biggest clubs in the world. And so they're overshadowed as a fan base, as a club, but they're punching above their weight. They have a really loud, passionate fan base. I've been to Selhurst Park as well. It's so loud. The fans are so passionate. And that's why I'm really so excited by this final. I feel like it'll be two fan bases, two clubs kind of telling their own story in European football, which they haven't had the opportunity to do so in the past. And so, Dan, my next question to you is, you've been to a few of these European aways with Palace and you're going to Leipzig. Like, what was your kind of favorite experience on this journey so far as a Palace fan in some of the stadiums you've been to, going to some of the cities that you may not have been to before?
Well, I mean, I tell this story of, well, I've sort of become used to telling it now because it just holds a very special place in my heart. So, I mean, I'm 37 and I did a thing the other day where I went through on an app and ticked off every game I've ever done. And I think it's 643 or something. I've had a season ticket at Palace pretty much my whole life. Done away games, done the whole thing. And for the most part, it's been a exercise in resilience. Obviously we've had 14 years in the Prem now, but prior to that, we'd had one or two, one at a time, relegated, long periods in the Championship. I'm not trying to get the violin out, but it just is the case. So I used to say all the time that I would figuratively cut off a limb to be able to watch my team play away from home in Europe. It was like a bucket list thing for me every single year when the summer rolls around and you see the Europa League and the Champions League draws and people are going to Madrid and people are going to Porto. I used to just think, imagine if we got that just once. And obviously we would have been in the Europa League if it weren't for a piece of paperwork back in March. I mean, that's another conversation entirely. So it took a while for the indignation over that particular story to wear off. But our first game in Europe was away after the qualifier that we played against Fredrikstad. We played Dynamo Kiev in Poland in a place called Lublin. And the ground was half empty because obviously it's a neutral venue and Dynamo Kiev didn't have a huge number of fans there. Why would they? But we went to this place in eastern Poland that you wouldn't go to otherwise. It's not a tourist trap at all. It's not like going to Milan. And won the game 2-0. Eddie Nketiah scored. Daniel Munoz scored. And similar to the Fiorentina and the Shakhtar Donetsk thing, regardless of where Dynamo Kiev have fallen to now, they are still a team who, in my mind, are European royalty, particularly compared to us. So to see us go away from home, win that comfortably, take the 3 points, first game in Europe, keep the clean sheet, was fantastic. We then went back to the main square/street of Lublin. And because there were no rival fans there, we had the run of every single bar, every single kebab house, every single everything. And the beer was cheap. There were people on that away trip that I'd seen up and down the country for decades, in away ends, the same faces. You don't know their names, but you nod at them or you give them a thumbs up. And everyone was in these bars just in this state of suspended joy and shock. I can't explain it any other way. Anyone who was there, any Palace fan who was in Lublin, talks about Lublin to the point where it annoys every other Palace fan who wasn't there because they go, oh, I get it. I wasn't in Lublin. So, but we're not trying to rub it in the faces of everybody. And obviously we've had wins away. That we went to Dublin before Christmas and we beat Shelbourne, and I've done Florence and I've done Poland again to see us beat Shakhtar. But that first experience was so perfect. I was in this karaoke bar and everybody was just loving life. They put the last 10 minutes of the FA Cup final on YouTube and everyone was watching the 10 minutes tick down. And then the final whistle goes on a YouTube video and everyone's hugging and celebrating just because there was a mixture of alcohol, obviously, but you just couldn't quite believe that we were there and we were winning and we were doing this thing that no one thought we would ever get the chance to do. And it was transformative, to be quite honest.
Yeah, honestly, like you can't beat a European away, and especially as you say, the roguer ones are always they're the more enjoyable ones compared to. I'd imagine. I mean, I've been to Florence and it's an unbelievable place, but as a trip, Yeah, Lublin sounds Lublin sounds like
Also,
the best.
Mostar as well. Like Mostar is in Bosnia, obviously, and we flew to
Oh yeah, wow.
Sarajevo, and then got a 3-hour 7-seater van through the mountains of Bosnia to go to Mostar. Like, again, you just wouldn't go there. I'm not, obviously people go to these city breaks. It's not somewhere I would have gone, but having done it, there's something I said this to somebody else. Watching your team away from home in Europe is such a strange experience because it's like a stag do, but with a mission. You're not going on holiday and you're not going for work. But everyone's there for a specific reason, and you see these people in departure lounges or in hotels or bars around these cities, and they're there for the same reason as you. But it's such a strange and alien experience. I love every single second of it, to be quite honest.
Yeah, and those are the memories that you cherish for a lifetime. And it's the same for Rayo. They've had such a magical journey as well. They went to Athens to play IEK. Our friend of the podcast, Dave, shout out Dave. He was at the game in Athens. He's an Athens fan. And yeah, he sent me clips of the atmosphere and it just looked remarkable. And they've had a dramatic run as well because they won 3-0 at home, but lost 3-1 away. And
I was watching
they
those
were
highlights.
3-0 down.
Sorry to interject. I was after we
Yeah.
did our interview, right? I went and watched those second leg highlights because they were on the ropes in that second leg as well, weren't they? And then they scored that goal to equalise, to get them back to 3-1 and in front in the tie again. And was it Issy who scored that goal? Right?
Yeah, Issy Palazon, yeah.
Yeah. And then the camera panned to their away end, and there was just chaos going on. And I just thought to myself, it's so annoying that we're playing them in the final because I love everything about them. Like, I want them to win it in a strange. Obviously, I don't. But if it weren't us, I'd be fully in. And it's a real shame that we potentially have to be the ones to not let them win it.
Yeah, well, that's football. And also, as I say, even if they lose, it's still just been such a remarkable journey. But yeah, so going back to the game itself, and yeah, you mentioned Issy Palazon. For me, he's one of the players to look out for. He is a Rayo legend. He is such a technically gifted footballer. He's got a lot of flair. He will be fully fresh for the final because for those who don't know him, he received a 7-game ban in La Liga for antagonizing the referee. And Rayo were keen on getting that ban kind of reduced. They appealed it, nothing doing. So he won't be playing against Alaves. His last game was against Strasbourg. He played very well in those games. But yeah, so that's one very, very physically fresh player ready to make an impact. So let's talk about the other players for Rayo, who I think Palace fans will be keen on knowing who could damage them. And Dan, you were spot on when you said you're surprised at how good at set pieces they are, because Rayo are a very physical team. And perhaps their most physical player, perhaps one of the most physical players I've ever seen, is centre-back Florian Lejeune. And I don't know if you remember him. He used to play for Newcastle. I don't think he was there for very long.
I do remember his name, yeah. I can't say that I remember a great deal about his game at Newcastle, but I remember him being there.
Yeah, and he's someone who has reinvented himself at Rayo, and he's a player they absolutely love. And he's 34, he's French. There were even calls for him to go to the World Cup. That's how good he's been this season. And one thing to notice, and yeah, you'll notice this during the final, is that despite being, he's an absolute giant of a bloke. He must be about 6'5", 6'6". He takes their direct free kicks as a centre back, and that's not something you see often in the modern game, like David Luiz. But I think when you see that happen, if it happens in the final, and he's lining up to take it, don't be surprised because I've told you so. But yeah, Florian Lejeune, I was at Mestalla last week. I was at Valencia against Rayo, and it was a set piece they scored from for a 1-1 draw. And he just towered above everyone and just bullet header. And that's something that I think
saw the highlights for that as well.
Yeah.
That was one of the main reasons that I was like, oh, their set pieces are quite... They should have scored against Strasbourg. They had a chance with about 5 minutes to go in the first leg. A free header from about 8 yards. I don't know quite how they managed to get as free as they did, but I remember thinking, this is a serious problem, these set pieces. So...
Yeah, well, and it was a set piece that they scored from for Alimao in the first leg. And Alimao is another player to watch because for most of this season, he's been a very underwhelming transfer, underwhelming striker to the point where they started playing Izzy Palazon as a false nine. They were trying to, or Jorge de Frutos as a false nine. Randy Anteca came in and out of the team. It was becoming a problem that they didn't have a reliable number nine. Despite playing such good football, they couldn't find the back of the net. But this Conference League run has transformed him. And he scored home and away in the semi-finals to send Rayo to the final. He scored against Villarreal at the weekend. And he's now a player to watch. He's quite physical. He feels taller than he actually is just because he's good in the air. And when you've got a striker in good scoring form, they're always a problem on the big occasions. And every single goal he scored this season has been a match winner or an equaliser. So he's someone who steps up there. And as I said on your one last week, the creative hub behind the striker for Rayo is so good. That's where probably their main threat is. And that will be Izzy Palazon. That will be Jorge de Frutos, who was in the Spain squad earlier this year. And he is their top scorer. He kind of drifts in from the right. He finds space in the box. He gets on the end of chances. Very technically gifted player. On the left wing, there's a bit of a doubt. It might be Ilyas Alkamak, who came in on loan from Villarreal in January. Moroccan international. You might recognise him from the AFCON final. He's a very quick, nimble player with a lot of skill. Often plays on the right and cuts in on his left, but they found success with him on the left, darting and crossing it in. He's an injury doubt for the final. I'm not sure if he'll make it. So that could be a big, big miss for them. And I think the last player I'd like to highlight is, I think it's Andre Ratiu, who is a right back who loves to get forward. Vic and I spoke about this before. In a similar vein to Daniel Munoz, where, yeah, he can get the crosses in. He is so secure on the ball in possession. He loves driving forward. And so tactically, I think that's where the key battles are. I think there has to be a way of limiting Rayo's attacking presence. Don't give away too many set pieces if you can. And yeah, I think you'd probably go with Mateta because of the physicality of the two Rayo centre backs. That would be Lejeune and Pathé Cis, who's a converted midfielder to a right back. To a centre back. And so, yeah, so the next question I'd like to ask is about Palace's future, actually, because as we said, Iñigo Pérez is leaving Rayo Vallecano. He took over Rayo in February 2024, a few months after the departure of a certain Andoni Iraola. And for those who know Iraola, he was you might know him from Bournemouth and what a remarkable job he's done there. He's been heavily linked with the Palace job. But what you might not know is the impact he made at Rayo. And so, Dan, what are your potential thoughts on Iraola potentially replacing Glasner?
I feel that, it would be the ideal appointment for a number of reasons. You look at the way that our squad is set up at the moment. I don't mean to sound over the top in terms of our potential, because obviously Bournemouth have had a fantastic season in the Premier League, and whether that is down to their recruitment or whether it's down to him or whether it's down to sort of serendipity or a mixture of all three of those things, he has been at the helm during this fantastic run. So I look at the way that Glasner has handled the Crystal Palace project over 2 years. I've already mentioned that, he has completely shifted the way that we feel about our chances of future success. But if Andoni Iraola was to come in, you look at the style of football, you look at players that we have at our disposal, Ismail Assar, Adam Wharton, the potential for Daichi Kamada to stay. He's out of contract at the end of this season, but I feel like Iraola would be a perfect manager for him. You've got a back five that's very, very settled. You've got JD Canvo there, who I am convinced will go on to be a full French international. You've got Maxence Lecor, who already is one. Chris Richards is going to be going to the World Cup. Dean Henderson's an England goalkeeper. Tyreek Mitchell, for me, should be more involved in the national conversation than he is in terms of his defensive abilities. You've got so many players that have undeniably proven themselves over the last 2 years, but would thrive in an environment where the next managerial appointment we made was a positive one rather than a stopgap. And I'm constantly torn between trying to reinvent the wheel and recapture that lightning in the bottle that Oliver Glasner has given us, but also not wanting to take a negative step. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way towards some of the names like Thomas Frank or Sean Dyche that are currently available. But if you look at what we have been able to do, one of the most, and it sounds ridiculous, but one of the most happy coincidences of this is that prior to Oliver Glasner coming in, the only foreign manager that we had put in charge was Frank de Boer, and it was a complete disaster. And we quickly rode back from that. Roy Hodgson came in the definition of a steady hand at the wheel, and I think it led many inside and outside Palace to assume that we needed that sort of personality to thrive. But Oliver Glasner has completely blown up that assumption. He has proven that that is not the case, and that in itself is something that should embolden us, I would hope, to go into the managerial market and feel that someone like an Andoni Iraola can come in and be, the next man to take us on. I'm not sure he would have even been linked with the job seriously, given his current star and how it has risen, if it weren't for the fact that Crystal Palace, alongside Bournemouth in the last couple of years, have done the same. And, that's really my hope, is that we continue with a dynamic appointment, someone in the mould of Andoni Iraola, if it isn't going to be him, who can continue this, and I don't like the phrase, but project that we have built over the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And Vic and I were discussing this as well, where the feeling in Spain is that Iraola is a top manager. And when it was kind of clear that he was to leave Bournemouth, with Ernesto Valverde also leaving Athletic Club this summer, where Iraola is a legend, he made over 500 appearances for them, it almost felt like a perfect kind of matchup where Iraola would go to Athletic Club and kind of lead their next phase after Valverde, who's been there a long time. But it didn't happen. They went for Edin Terzic instead, despite the availability of Iraola and several other Basque managers, including Iñigo Pérez. And so initially there was a lot of surprise, but then the feeling now is that Iraola is not going to go to Athletic Club yet, because he's so attached to the club that he doesn't want to fail there. And so if he thinks it's the wrong time to go, he doesn't want to go and do that. But my prediction is that at some point in the future, whether it's 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, Iraola will be managing Athletic Club. But before then, I think he's a manager who, from what we saw at Rayo and even at Bournemouth as well, he is someone who values a bit of control over the club. He's a disciple of Marcelo Bielsa in that sense. And he's also someone who's not going to get sucked into a project that he thinks is going to fail. With Chelsea and United potentially having availability this summer, there was talk of those two clubs, but I couldn't see it at all, because he's not someone who is enamored by the idea of, come here, spend millions, but you're potentially out the door in 7 months. So I think if he does go to Palace, it's because Palace have offered him, a bit more potential control over transfers in Bournemouth and a step up. If Palace win against Rayo, his old club, then they'll be in Europe again. And they will have a fairly big budget. They already have, as you say, the potential with several international players. And one of those players, so we'll go on to the next topic now, is a player we spoke about before, Yeremy Pino. For our La Liga listeners, because we've got a bit of a Villarreal audience as well, what are your thoughts on Yeremy's first year in England? Where do you think he needs to improve? What has he done well so far? And what do you think the impact Iraola can have on him?
I feel that Yeremy Pino's maiden season with us has been the definition of up and down. I felt for him immediately, really, because if you look at the circumstances that surrounded his arrival, it was tied directly to Iber Eze moving on for Arsenal. And they are not the same player. They can't occupy the same role. And to try and shoehorn Yeremy Pino into being that would be foolish. He is someone who has spoken openly about being homesick during this first year, not in a sense of him throwing his toys out the pram and saying he wants to leave and head back to Spain, but instead being genuinely open emotionally and admitting that it has been a difficult adaptation for him. I don't think he's necessarily got to grips with the language as quickly as he would like to have done. And often it has felt as though rather than him not trying, I think it's been a case of him over trying more often than not. He scored away at Liverpool in the League Cup for us back in September or October in front of the travelling fans and sort of put his hands together in a please forgive me sort of way because he didn't feel as though he had lived up to his own expectations. And I think that has been evident throughout this season. He has, and this isn't necessarily a problem, but his name has been sung routinely throughout this campaign in relation to us going to Leipzig. That's a song. His name almost fits too well for it to not be part of the song. It's not as though we are singing it because we expect him to carry us on his back. But at the same time, I think it may have almost done him a bit of harm because he feels like the fans are needing something from him. He's proven himself, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of his technical ability. There is no doubt about that. I think he has struggled somewhat with the physical rigours of Premier League football. You know, he's quite diminutive, and even if you do have a decent centre of gravity, you are going to get knocked off the ball a lot in the Prem unless you sort of get on the weights a bit. And maybe that is something that he can do across a summer. But I mean, I make the comparison all the time to Daichi Kamada. You've got a Japanese fully fledged international who had previously played for Eintracht Frankfurt and Lazio, won the Europa League at Eintracht Frankfurt with Oliver Glasner, came in on a 2-year deal, and for the first 12 months of his time with us was very underwhelming. And that's because it's an adaptation. You can't just expect everyone to come to the Prem and click straight away. Some people do, others don't. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to be long-term suited. And Daichi Kamada this season has been fantastic for us. So I feel as though with a full pre-season under his belt, with understanding the club and the culture in the league and the language, he will hit the ground running next season, hopefully with a manager, if it is to be Andoni Iraola, who understands him implicitly as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from my perspective of Yeremy Villarreal, he's someone who, yeah, he has a lot of talent and a lot of technical ability, but he's also had a tough few years because he had a long-term injury. And it took him a while to get back to any sort of form after it. He went over a year without a goal and he plays with a lot of emotion. And yeah, I'm glad he picked up on that where he kind of tries too hard in a way. And he was very emotional when he netted his first goal after a year in January last year. And towards the end of his time at Villarreal, he wasn't even a starter at that point. I think he was struggling for consistency so much that he was in and out of the team and he was overshadowed by someone like Alex Baena, who was the talisman at Villarreal. But there's a lot of love for him there because of his character, because of the potential for his talent. He's someone who started a Europa League final at 18 years old when Samu Chukwueze was injured. And now he could potentially be starting in another final. He's likely to go to Spain, go to the World Cup with Spain this summer. So already he's at the age of 23, he's already achieved a lot in his career. When you also factor in that he missed almost a year of his career. And so, yeah, it's brilliant to hear that the fans still like him and still back him. And I think, yeah, if he has a full, well, depending on how Spain do in the World Cup, if he has a pre-season under his belt and just adapts to life a bit more in London, then, yeah, I think you'll see a much better Yeremy next year. But he has been back at Villarreal here and there to watch the team. It's like, yeah, it's the club of his life. Came through the academy. He's been there since a very, very young age before moving to Palace. And the sale was because Villarreal essentially had a selling summer last summer. They sold 100 million euros. They signed 100 million euros. Then in a much stronger financial position now. But at the time, I think they weren't that keen on letting him go. And Marcelino, the manager, he was pretty annoyed at letting him go. He spoke openly saying, why is one of our Spain internationals going to the Premier League? And I think it was just a case of he hadn't found his consistent form yet, and the money, it was an opportunity to raise a huge amount of money. And so yeah, I think this is a nice little catch up about Yeremy. So going back to the final where Yeremy will likely start, you said it could be between him and Brennan Johnson, but I'm sure he will appear on the pitch at some point. What are your predictions for how the final might play out?
Um, it's so difficult because you don't want to come across at all arrogant. I am not. I think that's pretty clear from the first section of this podcast that I am not expecting a cakewalk in any sense. I do feel, and I'd like your input on this in a sense. I do feel that the high press nature of Rayo's game could potentially play into our hands a little bit because, I mean, I've watched extended highlights of both the semi-final games against Strasbourg, and particularly in the second leg away from home, often Strasbourg were getting caught on the ball in their defensive third. And obviously, we have a central defensive trio. We have a build from the back mentality in a sense, but we are pretty good at dealing with that and setting traps for people to press us, and then finding someone like an Ismail Assar who over the first 10 or 15 yards is as quick as anybody and has the physicality to get away from his man as well. So in a sense, Rayo's game sort of plays into our hands a little bit. If you're looking at it from a blueprint point of view, it may well not work out that way. But I feel, and I think I said this to you when we were interviewing on my pod, I feel like the first goal is going to be so important in this game. If we do similar to what we did against Shakhtar in the first leg in Poland, I mean, we scored after 21 seconds there, completely took the wind out of their sails. It enabled us to control the game more. It put them on the back foot, and it just gave us that platform to build upon where our greater physicality and maybe Premier League nous came to the fore. But at the same time, if Rayo get to half-time 0-0 or they go 1-0 up, the way that they play, the energy that they exert could panic us massively. We aren't great when we are chasing games because we play quite a vertical style of football under Oliver Glasner anyway. So you naturally leave spaces and sort of rely on that defensive trio to mop it up. But if you're chasing a goal with the way that Rayo operate, I feel like it could be curtains. But as I say, the first goal for me is so important in this one.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think for Rayo, it's not a question of how well they'll perform because at their best, they're such a good footballing side. They play with such intensity, such flair. Their problem throughout the league season has been taking their chances in big moments. And I said this last week as well. One of their best performances was away at the Camp Nou against Barcelona, and they could have won 3 or 4-1 at that point, but they just didn't take their chances. And my fear for Rayo is that they could shock Palace with their intensity, but if they kind of don't take their chance early on and Palace goes score, then it's such a frustrating thing to happen in a final that, as you say, it could be the deciding factor. But if they get on the front foot and get an early goal, then it'll be really interesting to see how Palace respond. I don't think either side will be prepared to give up without a fight. It will be an intense game until either side goes 2 goals clear or till the final whistle. So to wrap things up, what is your, using your head or your heart, what is your score prediction for the game?
Well, I think, I make a point whenever I do these previews of never predicting us to lose because I just can't. It feels disingenuous as a fan of a football club to do that. But I am not expecting in any sense for this to be a straightforward victory. I would imagine something like a 2-1 is probably the most likely outcome. I wouldn't necessarily back us to win it if we concede first. I can see a scenario where potentially we score 20, 25 minutes in and either go 2-0 up and then let one back in with 10 minutes to go and make it a bit nervy for ourselves, or potentially go 1-1 and then score again. But I don't expect us to run away with it. I just hope that we have, as I say, that greater degree of game management that we've, built over the last 18 months or so under Glasner as well. This isn't me sort of talking out of hand. You look at the games against Aston Villa in the semi-final of the FA Cup. You look at the final against Manchester City. We took the lead after 15 or 16 minutes in that one. And yeah, we rode our luck, but we are able to sort of dig in. even if you look at the semi-final against Shakhtar, they had a lot of the ball in that first leg. I think it was something like 70% in Poland, but we never really looked that much in danger because we were able to manage the territory as it was. So, look, I don't know, but if I was going to nail my colours to the mast, I would say 2-1 Palace, and it'd be a relatively closely run affair that we eventually come out on top in.
Yeah, I'm going to say similar in that it will be such a close affair. It's going to be such a knife edge. It's going to come down to a big moment. But as the host of a La Liga podcast, I'm going to be backing Rayo here and say 2-1 Rayo. But I'm really excited for the final, and I hope you have an amazing time in Leipzig. One thing to note is as well, Rayo fans are just some of the most amazing people I've ever met. When I went to Vallecas, they were all so friendly and welcoming. One guy I met on the metro came and invited me to the pub he goes to. We had a few beers together. And yeah, I think in Leipzig, I really hope both sets of fans who are there just go and enjoy it and enjoy the occasion, enjoy the spectacle. I hope it's a really good game. And Dan, thank you so much for coming on as the first ever guest of the Tiki Tapas podcast. And for those who are discovering us through Dan, we delve into topics in Spanish football, but beyond the big two. So we rarely, if ever, talk about Barcelona or Real Madrid or the boring topics surrounding them and Vinicius Jr. and whoever else there is. But we like to do deep dives into the teams you might not know too much about. We have a weekly episode. We talk about the games that are on display. The season's about to end, so it won't be the case. But yeah, normally Vic also does a lot of speaking, but he obviously couldn't today. And yeah, we have such an appreciation for football beyond the kind of mainstream narratives, which is why I'm such a big fan of HLTCO as a page, because it opens the eyes of the audience to football just beyond the kind of Premier League Big Six and what's happening at Arsenal and Man United. And so thank you so much for coming on, Dan. What are your thoughts as we draw this episode to a conclusion?
I just want to say thanks for that lovely testimony, I suppose, towards me, because I don't do it for any other reason than being somebody who absolutely loves football and always has. And I feel that there is always a great deal to be gained by learning about things that are off the beaten track, narrative-wise. And given your podcast and the fact that you don't focus on the bigger clubs in Spain, I feel that there is such an underappreciated audience that don't necessarily get their flowers, shall we say, because they aren't immediately reachable. But if you can scratch that particular itch, then it takes you a long way. So yeah, thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for having me on the podcast. And hopefully, despite the fact that this is a Liga-centric one, you're not too happy come the final whistle on Wednesday.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think whatever happens, if it's a good game, and I'd like to see it be a close game. You never like seeing kind of finals like Villa Freiburg the other day where it's over by half time. So I just hope it's a really good game and a good spectacle of football, and both clubs get to showcase what they're all about, both in terms of fan culture and playing style on a big stage like the Conference League final. So yeah, that was episode 14 of the Tiki Tapas podcast. We're on Spotify, YouTube, Instagram. I'm La Liga London on Twitter. That's La Liga Vic on Instagram and on TikTok, I believe. No, I'm on TikTok. He's not on TikTok. We're on YouTube. So yeah, come subscribe, join us, comment on the posts, come say hi. And yeah, also, if you don't already follow Dan, HLTCO, follow him because, yeah, he's one of my favorite pages on Twitter. So yeah, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next week.